Story number 1. The Bed Beneath the Moon. Jimmy never liked the bed. Not the soft mattress or the plush pillows, but the old wooden frame that creaked with the slightest movement, as though it were alive. It wasn't the kind of thing that made you feel safe, but he had to sleep in it. The bed that his parents had given him when they moved into this old house. At first, it didn't bother him too much. He'd toss and turn and eventually fall asleep. But there was always something strange about it. Something that felt off. It wasn't just the noises, it was the way the sheets would twist around his legs, almost as if they were pulling at him. He could never get comfortable, always tugging at the blankets in the middle of the night, his legs tangled in some unseen force. But he didn't think much of it. He figured it was just the way things were in this old house. That was until the night Billy didn't come back. Billy was his little brother. A funny kid, full of energy, always talking about the monsters under the bed or the ghosts in the closet. He'd laugh it off, calling Billy a scaredy cat, but deep down, something about the house made him uneasy too. Jimmy wasn't sure if it was the house or just the way things had been lately. The strange noises in the walls, the creaking floorboards, the way the air felt colder at night. But they never said anything to their parents. Not until Billy went missing. It happened one night when they were both supposed to be in bed. Jimmy was lying there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside the window. Billy, on the other hand, had gotten up and walked to the bathroom. Jimmy had heard him, but Billy never came back. At first, Jimmy thought it was just a prank. Maybe Billy was hiding in the closet, waiting to scare him. But the house was quiet, too quiet. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and Billy's slippers were sitting neatly by the door. Jimmy got up to check, his heart beating faster with each step. The air around him felt colder, a draft flowing through the room as he reached the hallway. He called out for Billy. No answer. The bed in the next room stood silent, just the way it always had. The sheets were still pulled up tightly, as if Billy had never been in there. But there was a strange shape beneath the covers, a lump that looked too unnatural. Jimmy stepped closer, his throat tight, his pulse racing. The lump shifted, and with a sickening creak, the bed seemed to move on its own, the wooden frame groaning like it had a life of its own. "Billy?" Jimmy whispered, his voice trembling. And then, the bed shifted again, and from beneath the covers, Billy's face appeared, pale, wide-eyed, staring at him with an expression that Jimmy would never forget. It wasn't his brother's face anymore. It was different. Distorted, like something had warped it, twisted it into something else. And the eyes, they weren't Billy's eyes, they were hollow, dark pits of emptiness. Before Jimmy could scream, the bed seemed to reach up with a sickening crack and a jolt of movement, as if it was alive. The covers slid down, and the wooden frame stretched out, its legs twisting and bending, growing longer, wider, reaching for Jimmy. The bed had an insatiable hunger, and it was hungry for more. Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The bed seemed to close in around him, its wooden frame groaning with a life of its own. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it all stopped. The bed went still again, as if nothing had happened. Jimmy stood frozen in place, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen. Billy was gone. His brother, his little brother, had disappeared into the bed, consumed by something that was too horrible to understand. That night, as Jimmy lay in his own bed, trying to sleep, he felt it again. The cold air, the creaking, the shifting of sheets. He pulled the covers up over his head, but the bed didn't care. It wanted him. It always did. and as the moonlight filtered through the window, Jimmy could hear it. The soft, insistent creak of the bed beneath him, waiting, hungry for the next one. Always hungry, always wanting more. Story number 2. A place where dreams die. For as long as Max could remember, his father had always warned him about the bed. It wasn't like any other bed in their house. It was an old, heavy thing, with a dark wooden frame that seemed to sag under the weight of years. Years of history, years of secrets. "It's not for children," his father would say, his voice low, the words heavy with something Max could never quite place. His father's eyes would drift away, as if he were remembering something he didn't want to. There was always a look in his eyes when he spoke of that bed. A distant look, like he was afraid. Max had never understood why. Why was the bed so special? It was just a bed after all. It sat in the corner of the room, hidden beneath heavy curtains that his mother would always make sure were drawn tight. Every night, Max would catch glimpses of it in the dark, and every night he would wonder why his father always made sure he stayed away from it. "Why?" Max would ask, but his father would never answer. Just a sigh, just a shake of his head. "It's not for children," was all he would say. Curiosity, like an itch you can't scratch, crept into Max's mind, and the older he got, the harder it was to ignore. His father's warnings, no matter how serious, only made the bed seem more fascinating. Max found himself drawn to it, unable to shake the thought of what might lie beneath the faded sheets and dusty blankets. Why was it locked away? Why was it forbidden? One night, when the house was silent and the only sound was the distant howl of the wind, Max made up his mind. He had to see for himself. He had to know what made the bed so dangerous. His father was in the kitchen, and his mother had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Max crept through the hallway, his heart beating fast in his chest, each step louder than the last. He reached the door to the room. It was cracked open, just enough for him to slip inside unnoticed. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The bed was there, just like always, sitting in the corner of the room. Max hesitated, his hand resting on the door frame. He glanced back, but there was no sign of his father. He was alone. He stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Slowly, he moved toward the bed. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as if the bed itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. With one last glance over his shoulder, Max climbed into the bed. The sheets were cold, older than anything he'd ever felt. The mattress sagged under his weight, and for a moment he felt like he was sinking into the bed. But the feeling didn't last. It was soon replaced with something far worse. Max couldn't move. It wasn't that he couldn't physically move. It was more like something inside him was holding him still, locking him in place. His body felt heavy, and his mind began to blur. His eyes were wide open, yet he couldn't seem to wake up. The room around him grew darker, the shadows stretching and curling into shapes that didn't make sense. The walls seemed to close in, the bed sinking deeper into the ground. Max felt like he was falling, like the bed was pulling him down into the earth itself. And then, it started. Nightmares. But not like any nightmares Max had ever known. These weren't just images or thoughts. These felt real. They felt alive. He saw faces, twisted and contorted, their eyes wide with fear. He heard whispers, voices calling him to do things he couldn't understand. The bed beneath him groaned, like it was alive, like it was feeding on his fear. The more he tried to scream, the harder it became to breathe. He tried to get up, but his limbs were frozen, paralyzed. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room around him dissolved into darkness, and all he could hear were those whispers, growing louder, growing closer. They were calling his name, calling him to stay in the bed forever. Max felt his pulse quicken. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, but it was too late. The bed had taken hold of him. It had a grip on him that he couldn't escape. He could see himself now, lying in the bed, his face pale and his eyes wide open, trapped in a nightmare so real it felt like death itself. The bed wasn't just a bed. It was a place where dreams went to die. A place where children like Max were never meant to go. When Max finally woke up, he was lying in his own bed, in his own room, drenched in sweat. His heart was pounding, but the night was still. The house was quiet. But something was wrong. He knew it. He could feel it. He didn't know how long he had been asleep or if what he had experienced was real. But one thing was clear. He would never, ever go near that bed again. He could still hear the whispers even now, in the back of his mind. They hadn't gone away, and Max knew that the bed wasn't finished with him. Not yet. Story number 3. The Mattress's Whisper. Alice had always loved the bed her grandmother gave her. It was old, worn out, and a little saggy in the middle, but it had a certain comfort to it, something that made her feel safe. The mattress smelled like dust, the kind of musty smell that only old things have, but to Alice, it was comforting. The pillow was faded, the fabric threadbare in places, but every night when she climbed under the covers it felt like home. There was something warm about it, a feeling of love and care that her grandmother had put into it over the years. But that was before the whispers started. It wasn't immediate. At first, Alice thought she was just imagining it. She'd always been the kind of person who believed in ghosts, in things that went bump in the night, but she wasn't the kind to get scared easily. So, when she first heard the soft whispers one night, she brushed them off as the wind, or maybe the house settling. After all, the old house creaked and groaned at night, everyone knew that. But the whispers didn't stop. They were soft at first, just gentle little murmurs, like someone was singing a lullaby just out of reach. It wasn't a voice Alice recognized, but it was calming in a way, almost comforting. At first, she would smile and close her eyes, lulled by the soothing sound. It was like being rocked to sleep by a mother, or so she thought. But night after night, the whispers grew louder, and the more they grew, the darker they became. The sweet, lullaby-like murmurs slowly turned into words. Words Alice couldn't quite understand at first. It was as if the mattress itself was speaking to her, its voice muffled and soft, yet clear enough to send a chill down her spine. Stay. 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 The words were soft at first, almost like a plea. They were soothing, yes, but now there was a sense of urgency, of hunger behind them. The whispering seemed to come from deep within the mattress itself, as though the springs were alive, groaning with every breath it took. The pillow beneath her head felt warm, warmer than usual, and for the first time, Alice felt uneasy. She tried to ignore it. She tossed and turned, pulled the covers tighter around her, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. Stay with me, forever. Now, the voice wasn't just pleading. It was demanding. It was desperate. Alice's heart began to race. The mattress seemed to shift beneath her, like something heavy was moving inside it. The air in the room grew thick and stifling, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Alice sat up, her heart pounding in her ears, the whispers still swirling around her like a storm. She looked around the room, but everything was just as it should be. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Nothing was out of place. But the whispers were everywhere. They were coming from the bed, from the mattress beneath her. Stay, stay, stay forever. Alice wanted to scream, wanted to jump out of the bed and run, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped under the weight of the whispers. The mattress beneath her seemed to be sucking her in, pulling her down deeper and deeper, until it felt like the bed itself was swallowing her whole. That's when she understood. The whispers weren't just asking her to stay. They weren't just begging or pleading. They were demanding something. The mattress wanted her. It had always wanted her. It had been waiting for her, and it wouldn't let her go. The bed was old, yes, but it was more than just old. It was ancient. It had been passed down through the generations, each person who slept in it becoming a part of it, bound to it in some way. It had taken her grandmother before her, and now it was coming for Alice. With a final, bone-chilling whisper, the mattress shifted once more. It pulled at her, tugging at her limbs, pulling her deeper into its dark, suffocating depths. She could feel the springs, cold and sharp, digging into her skin, the fabric of the mattress rubbing against her like it was alive. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the bed itself. Her body, her soul, everything she was, began to melt into the mattress, absorbed by it as if she were nothing more than a forgotten memory. And when the whispers stopped, when the mattress was still once more, Alice was gone. The bed was empty, but it didn't matter. It was patient. It would wait for the next one. And the whispers would begin again. Story number 4. The Hungry Child's Bed. Timmy had always been the quiet child, the kind who didn't make a fuss. His parents never had to worry about him asking for things, never complained when dinner was late or when his favorite toy was lost. He didn't need much, except for one thing: the bed in the attic. It was an old, creaky thing. The kind of bed you'd find in a house that had been standing for too long, with a dark history woven into every rickety board. The bed had deep indentations in the mattress, as though someone had been lying in it for years, even though no one could ever remember anyone using it. It had that musty smell, the smell of dust, mildew, and something else that was far too faint to place. Maybe it was the smell of time itself. And yet, Timmy wanted that bed. He wanted it more than anything else, and it wasn't as if his parents were blind to his obsession. At first, they'd shrugged it off. Kids are strange, they thought. Maybe he liked the quiet up there. Maybe he felt safe in the dark. But the more Timmy asked, the more insistent he became. He wasn't a child who begged, but when it came to that bed, something in him changed. His pale blue eyes would widen whenever he spoke of it, his hands shaking just slightly, as though he were asking for permission to enter a room he already knew too well. "Mom, I want to sleep in the attic bed tonight," Timmy would say, his voice barely more than a whisper. And every time his parents would say no, at least not yet. It was too old, too dangerous. It didn't belong to them after all. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had long since disappeared from their lives, leaving only a bed and unanswered questions in the attic. But one night, Timmy asked again. And this time, something about his voice was different. There was an edge to it, a hunger. "Just one night, please." His parents, exhausted from the weight of the world, finally relented. They thought it would be harmless. After all, what was the harm in letting a quiet boy sleep in the dusty old attic for a night? They were wrong. They were so terribly wrong. When they checked on him that night just before bed, Timmy was already up in the attic, tucked under the covers of that ancient bed. The room was colder than it should have been, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet as they peered in. They didn't like the way Timmy lay there, stiff as a board, staring up at the ceiling with a strange, vacant expression in his eyes. "Good night, sweetie," his mother said, her voice trembling a little as she closed the door behind her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, there were no cries, no calls for water or nightmares. The house was still. The next morning, Timmy was gone. His parents searched the house, frantically tearing through the rooms, checking every corner. There was no sign of him, no broken windows, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Hours passed, desperation turned into panic. Then they checked the attic again. They had to. They didn't know why, but something told them that the answers lay there. And that's when they found him. Timmy was lying in the bed, just as still as he had been the night before. But when they touched him, they recoiled in horror. He was cold. Colder than any child should be. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost gray in places. His limbs were stiff, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his body sagging slightly in the mattress, as though it had taken on a strange new weight. But it wasn't Timmy they found, not completely. Something was missing. Something deep inside him, something that couldn't be explained. He looked like Timmy, but his eyes, those pale, wide eyes, were different. They weren't his eyes. They were glassy, empty, as if they had been hollowed out, and the light behind them had gone out forever. His parents tried to scream, but no sound came out. Their mouths moved, but the horror they felt choked them into silence. That's when they noticed the bed. The deep indentations in the mattress were there, just as they had always been, but now they were deeper. Deeper than they should have been. And the mattress creaked, a soft groan, as though something was shifting beneath it. Something hungry. It took them a moment to realize the truth. The bed wasn't just a bed. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was something darker, something older. It had been waiting for someone to claim it. Waiting for someone who was small enough, quiet enough, to fall into its trap. And now it had Timmy. The whispers began then, faint and soft, as if carried on the wind. No one could hear them, not unless they were close enough. The mattress, soaked with whatever it had taken from Timmy, began to hum with a low, satisfied tone. It had fed, and it wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, the bed stayed in the attic, but no one dared go near it. They didn't speak of it. They didn't even think about it, not if they could help it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, they would hear the faint creaking of the old mattress, the softest of whispers. It was always hungry, always waiting for the next one. And deep in the folds of the bed, deep within the old creaking mattress, there was a soft, muffled voice that sounded too much like Timmy's. "Stay," it whispered. "Stay with me. Forever." Story number 5. Children of the Bed. It wasn't supposed to be a thing of legend. It was just an old bed, a forgotten piece of furniture in a house that no one bothered with anymore. The abandoned house on Elm Street had always been a subject of curiosity for the local kids, but no one ever took the story seriously. The house was old, falling apart, and everyone knew better than to go near it. But then, the children started to disappear. It was the kind of thing that you didn't think much of at first. A child goes missing here and there, and everyone assumes it's just an accident or a case of running away. But when it started happening every year, always around the same time, just as the leaves began to turn and the air grew colder, the whispers started. The bed in the abandoned house. It was always the same story. The bed would eat one child every year, devouring them whole. At first, the stories were just that, stories. Silly, childish things told in the dark by older kids to scare the younger ones. But after the fourth child went missing, and then the fifth, people began to wonder if there was some truth to the old tales. It was one of the local boys, Tommy, who went missing that year. He was last seen running past the old house, daring his friends to follow him inside. The next day, his bike was found abandoned in front of the house, its wheels still spinning. No sign of Tommy. The police searched the area, knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, but no one saw anything. The house was empty, just like it always had been. But that night, the whispers came back. The house was old, but it had a history. Everyone knew that. Long before it was abandoned, it had belonged to a family. They were never the kind of family that people spoke about with fondness. They kept to themselves, strange and reclusive. Rumors said they had a dark secret, one that no one could ever figure out. And when the family disappeared, so did all the questions. The bed in the attic was where they said it all began. It was a massive thing, made of dark oak and heavy fabric, covered in dust and cobwebs. But the stories said it wasn't just a bed. It was something else, something hungry. The bed was always there, waiting, calling to the children who dared get too close. It was said to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every child it took. And it didn't stop with just one. Over the years, more children disappeared. It was always the same, one child every year. And every time the bed got stronger, its hunger more insatiable. But it wasn't just a bed anymore. It wanted more, the entire neighborhood. It had started small, just a child here, a child there. But the bed had grown hungrier. Over the years, it had taken enough to feed itself, but now it craved more. It was no longer content with just one child a year. The bed wanted to devour the entire town. It wanted everyone. And so it began. One by one, the children of the neighborhood started to vanish. It was always the same, one child, then another. The whispers were louder now. The parents searched, desperate and frantic, but the children were gone, and all that was left were the same whispers that echoed in the streets. The bed had gotten too powerful. It had grown too strong to be ignored. No one knew how to stop it. No one knew what it wanted other than to feed. The people of the neighborhood tried everything: prayers, exorcisms, even fire, but nothing worked. The bed was insatiable, the house was cursed, and the bed would not be denied. By the time the last child disappeared, the neighborhood had become a ghost town. Empty houses, vacant streets. The bed had taken everything. And still, it hungered. The whispers continued in the wind, the stories passing from one generation to the next. But no one ever spoke of the bed again. It had gotten too powerful, too hungry, and now it would wait. Wait for the next group of children to dare venture too close. The bed had never been meant to be a legend, but now it was a story that no one could forget, a warning that no one dared ignore. The bed in the abandoned house was still there, waiting. Hungry. Story number 6. The bed that waits. Sophie had heard the rumors. Every child in town knew about the bed. It was a local legend, whispered about by the older kids. How it was never supposed to be there, how it fed on children's fear. The bed wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was something much darker, something that couldn't be explained in a way that made sense. It was said to have been in the old house at the end of the street for decades. The kind of house no one lived in, The kind of house that was always just a little too close to the woods, just a little too far from civilization. But Sophie never really believed in the stories. Fear had never been something she was familiar with. She wasn't afraid of the dark, or ghosts, or things that went bump in the night. She had always been the kind of child who laughed at silly rumors, the kind who didn't flinch when someone told her to watch out for the things that hid under the bed. Her parents had always told her the world was a safe place, and Sophie trusted them. That was until the night her parents went out, leaving her alone in the house. It was a regular night, nothing special. They had left for dinner and would be back late. Sophie was in her room, finishing up her homework, when she heard the knock on the door. It was late, but the knock came again, soft at first, then louder, more urgent. It was her parents, or at least she hoped it was. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. At first, Sophie thought she might be imagining things. She closed the door and went back to her desk. But then, she heard it again. A soft sound, like someone breathing. Not from outside, but from her bedroom. Sophie stood still, listening, her heart beginning to pound. She had locked all the windows, made sure the doors were secure. But the sound was coming from her room. Slowly, she made her way to the door of her room, her footsteps careful, like she was walking through a fog. As she stepped inside, her gaze immediately went to the bed. It was just sitting there, the covers neat and tidy, but there was something strange about it. The way it looked, the way it almost seemed to be waiting. Sophie tried to ignore the feeling in her chest, the small prickle of unease. She didn't want to believe in the stories, not now, not when she was so close to the comfort of her own home. But the bed, it was different somehow. It seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She tried to brush it off, tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination. After all, she was no longer a little kid who feared the shadows in the corners of the room. But then the whispers began. It started with a soft murmur, a voice that she couldn't quite make out, but it was there. It was low and inviting, almost like a lullaby. It was as though the bed itself was speaking to her. The voice was calm, soothing, and yet it held something dark, something beneath the surface. "Sophie," it whispered, "come closer." She shook her head, trying to tell herself it was nothing. But the voice, the whisper, only grew louder. It didn't sound like her parents, didn't sound like anyone she knew. It was colder, emptier. The bed seemed to draw her in, pulling her toward it like a magnet. Before she could stop herself, Sophie found herself standing next to the bed, the whispers filling her ears like a soft hum. She sat down on the edge, the mattress giving under her weight, and as she did, something strange happened. The room went quiet. Too quiet. At first, it was just a feeling, a presence, an energy in the room that Sophie couldn't see but could definitely feel. But then, as the minutes passed, something began to change. The air grew heavier, colder. The whispers were gone, replaced by something else. Something darker. The bed began to shift. It wasn't anything she could see, but she could feel it. The mattress seemed to sink under her, as if something was pushing up from below. Something inside it, something that wanted her. The bed wasn't just waiting for her fear, it was waiting for something more, something much worse. Sophie tried to stand up, but her body wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped by the bed's invisible grip. The whispers started again, only now, they weren't soft, they were sharp, insistent. "Give me what I want, Sophie," the bed hissed. "Give me your memories." She tried to scream, but the words were gone, swallowed by the bed. She could feel her mind being pulled, her thoughts slipping away, like water through her fingers. The bed was feeding on her memories, her innocence, her childhood. It wasn't after her fear. It didn't care about her nightmares. It wanted her past. It wanted everything she had ever known. Sophie could feel herself slipping, could feel the bed taking pieces of her that she would never get back. Her laughter, her joy, the faces of her parents, the warmth of her first birthday party, all of it gone. The bed was hungry, and it would not stop until it had consumed everything. By the time her parents returned home that night, they found Sophie sitting on the bed, staring at the wall with empty eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move. Her memories were gone, stolen by the bed that waited. And as the years passed, the house remained, empty and silent. The bed was still there, waiting for the next child to come along, hungry for what it had lost. And it would wait, as it always had, for the next Sophie to fall asleep. Because the bed that waits never gets full. It never stops feeding. Story number 7. The bed that feasts. Oliver never believed his sister's stories. Chloe was older, and like all older siblings, she loved to scare him with tales of things that went bump in the night. She would sit by his bed, leaning in close, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told him about the bed. The bed that ate children. The bed that fed on fear. He'd roll his eyes, tell her to stop making up stuff, and shove his face into his pillow pretending to sleep. But Chloe would always tell him more. How the bed had been around for years, maybe even longer, and how no one really knew where it came from. They'd moved into the house when Oliver was just a little kid, and the bed had always been there, sitting in the guest room, just waiting. The bed isn't just old, Chloe would say. It's something worse. It's a creature. It's hungry. It feeds on kids who are scared. That's why no one ever sleeps in it. It waits, and every year it gets stronger. Oliver would laugh, pull the covers over his head, and call her a freak. There was no way a bed could be a monster. He wasn't afraid of some old, dusty mattress, no matter how many stories Chloe told. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He wasn't afraid of anything. But that night something changed. It had started as a normal night, the kind that made Oliver feel safe in his own room. His parents were downstairs watching TV, and Chloe was in her room. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Oliver was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind wandering. The soft light from the street lamp outside filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Everything felt still, peaceful, safe. But then, there was a noise. It was faint at first, like a rustling, a scraping sound coming from somewhere nearby. Oliver sat up, straining his ears. His heart began to race. The rustling came again, this time louder, like something was moving beneath the bed. He pushed the covers off and slid out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He looked toward the guest room, the room where the bed was. The door was cracked open, just a sliver of darkness peeking through. The house was still, but now it felt different. He felt strange, like something was watching him. Something was waiting. Against his better judgment, Oliver walked toward the guest room, his footsteps slow, hesitant. The rustling was louder now, and the air around him felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. He reached the door and pushed it open. The bed was there, just like always. But tonight, something was different. The room was colder than it should have been, the air heavy with a strange, almost suffocating weight. The bed's old wooden frame groaned under an invisible strain, its mattress uneven, bulging in odd places. Oliver stepped closer, his breath shallow. The mattress moved again, this time more violently, as if something beneath it was trying to break free. He could hear a low, growling sound, something deep and unsettling, like the very bones of the house were shaking. And then it hit him. The bed wasn't just a bed, it was alive. The realization slammed into him like a punch to the gut. His heart raced, and the hairs on his neck stood on end. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, watching in horror as the bed shifted and twisted, its shape changing, warping into something far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. The mattress gave way with a sickening, wet sound, and something dark and writhing emerged from beneath it. It was a mass of shadow and tendrils, but there were eyes, dozens of eyes, all wide and hungry. The thing beneath the bed had been waiting for him, waiting for the right moment, waiting for his fear. And now it was awake. Oliver tried to move, tried to shout, but his voice caught in his throat. The creature, if that's what it was, crawled out, stretching and twisting, its limbs long and thin, like they had been stretched from the very fabric of the bed. It was hungry, and it wanted more than just fear. It wanted something deeper. It wanted his memories, his childhood. The bed, this creature, was feeding. Feeding on the innocence of childhood, on the things that made him laugh, the things that made him feel safe. It wanted everything he had left, and it wouldn't stop until it had devoured every part of him. Oliver stumbled backward, but it was too late. The bed's tendrils wrapped around him, pulling him back toward it. He felt cold, so cold, and the more it wrapped around him, the more he felt his memories slipping away. His laughter, his favorite games, his first bike ride, all of it was being drained away, leaving him empty, hollow. He heard Chloe's voice, faint, distant, calling his name, but it didn't matter. The bed, the creature, was too strong, too hungry. The last thing Oliver felt before everything went black was the bed's whispers in his mind, soft and insistent. "You belong to me now," it murmured. "You are mine, and I will feast on everything you've ever been." The bed was satisfied for now, but it would wait as it always did, because there would always be another child, another innocent soul to feed on, and it would be hungry again. Story number 8. The Nightmare Bed. When Jack first moved into the old house, everything seemed perfect. The house was big and creaky, just the way he liked it, with old hardwood floors that groaned under his feet and windows that rattled when the wind blew. It was a house that had been standing for generations, full of history, full of secrets. His parents had gotten a great deal on it, and Jack couldn't wait to explore every inch of it. But there was one thing in the house that never felt quite right. The bed. It was tucked into the far corner of the guest room, hidden behind a thick curtain. The bed wasn't anything special at first glance, just an old wooden frame with a faded mattress and a heavy quilt draped over it. But there was something about it that unsettled Jack. Maybe it was the way it seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. Maybe it was the way the room always felt colder when he got near it. Or maybe it was the way his parents would avoid talking about it whenever Jack asked. "Don't touch that bed, Jack," his mother would say, her voice too firm, too quick, as if she were trying to brush aside the very thought of it. And his father? Well, his father never said anything at all, but the way he would glance at the bed every time they passed by it, that nervous, tight look, made Jack wonder what was so wrong with it. But like every child, Jack didn't listen to the warnings. He wasn't scared of old furniture. He wasn't scared of anything. The bed was just an old thing, nothing special. At least, that's what he told himself. One night, after his parents had gone out, Jack found himself alone in the house. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Jack wasn't tired, but he was curious. Curiosity was his favorite thing, and tonight it led him to the guest room. The door creaked open as he stepped inside. The bed sat in the corner, just like before, its quilt a faded blue and white pattern. It looked normal. Nothing about it seemed dangerous or sinister. But Jack felt a strange pull toward it, an almost magnetic feeling, like it was calling to him. He crossed the room, his footsteps quiet on the old floor. He stood at the edge of the bed and stared down at it, hesitating for just a moment. And then, without thinking, he climbed in. The mattress felt strange. Too soft, too warm, like it had been waiting for him. As soon as he settled in, he felt it. The air around him seemed to shift. It wasn't the same. The room felt heavier, colder. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes you feel like you're being watched. He tried to brush it off, tried to tell himself it was just his imagination. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The bed seemed to be pulling him in, sinking him deeper into its embrace. And that's when he felt it. The whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, but more like a feeling. A low, growling hum deep in the pit of his stomach. He tried to move, to sit up, but the bed held him in place. His body felt stiff, like something was keeping him there, making it impossible to leave. The whisper grew louder, closer. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't kind, it was hungry. The bed was alive, and it was waiting. Suddenly, Jack felt the weight of the room around him, pressing in, suffocating him. The bed seemed to breathe, like it had lungs, like it was inhaling and exhaling with him. He could feel it, pulling at him, pulling at something deep inside of him, something he couldn't understand. And then, the bed spoke. "You're mine now." The words were like ice in his veins. Jack's heart raced. He tried to scream, to push himself out of the bed, but it was as if the bed had become part of him. His mind was foggy, his thoughts slipping away. The only thing he could feel was the bed, its hunger, its insatiable need. It wasn't satisfied with just his body. It wanted his memories, his dreams, his innocence. It wanted everything. Jack's body trembled, and tears welled up in his eyes. He couldn't fight it. He didn't know how. The bed's power was too strong, and the price for leaving, for escaping, was too steep for any child to pay. He tried to call out, to cry for help, but the words wouldn't come. His voice was lost in the suffocating weight of the bed's hold on him. He felt himself slipping away, piece by piece, as if something was being drained from him. And then, everything went dark. When his parents returned, they found Jack in the bed, his eyes wide open, staring into the nothingness. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. His body was still, but something was different. He wasn't the same child who had gone to bed that night. They never spoke of the bed again. No one did. It stayed in the guest room, just as it had always been, waiting for the next child to climb in to make the same mistake. And when they did, the bed would feast, as it always had, and as it always would. Because the bed was always hungry, and it never stopped waiting. Story number 9. The Silent Bed. In the quiet town of Hemlock Falls, nestled between the hills and the winding river, there was an old legend that had haunted children for generations. It was a story told in whispers, passed down from older kids to younger ones, always accompanied by a shiver or a nervous laugh. The tale was simple, yet terrifying. The bed that could consume you. Parents would warn their children, not to sleep in certain beds, not to sleep alone, not to let the dark get too close. And the children, despite their fears, would dare each other to sleep in the old beds in the abandoned houses, in places they weren't supposed to go. But there was always one bed, the one in the old house on the edge of town, that stood apart from the rest. It was said that if you lay in that bed, by morning, you would be gone. Not dead, no, not like that, just gone. The sheets would be crumpled, the frame cold, and there would be nothing left of you except a feeling of emptiness, of absence. Henry had grown up hearing the stories. He heard them from his friends, from the older kids who would grin as they told him the details, making his skin crawl. But Henry never believed it. It was all just a tale. A way for the adults to keep the kids in line, a trick to make them fear what they didn't understand. No bed could eat you, no bed could take you away. That was until the day he moved into the old house on the outskirts of town with his family. The house was big, older than anything Henry had ever seen, with high ceilings and creaky floors. The wallpaper peeled in places, and the air had a musty smell, like something had been forgotten there. It was the kind of house that felt alive, full of stories and memories, though no one really wanted to talk about them. Henry's parents had moved there to start fresh. They didn't care about the old rumors, the ones whispered by people in the town about things that happened in the house long before they arrived. But Henry couldn't ignore it. He knew the story of the bed. It was impossible to forget. It was the last thing he'd been warned about. The bed was in the guest room, a room no one ever used, and yet there it was, sitting under a dusty old blanket, the wooden frame dark and uninviting. He'd heard the stories about how children who slept in it disappeared, how they never came back. Henry thought it was all nonsense, a legend, nothing more. After all, it was just an old bed. So, when his parents weren't looking, he decided to prove the story wrong. One night, after a long day of exploring the house and finding all the dark corners and hidden rooms, Henry made his way to the guest room. The door creaked as he opened it, and the faint smell of dust and forgotten things filled the air. He glanced over at the bed, just a simple wooden frame with a thin, faded mattress. Nothing special. Nothing to be afraid of. He climbed into the bed, pulling the covers up around him, trying to ignore the growing unease in his stomach. The room was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and the silence was so thick it felt like something was pressing in on him. But Henry was determined. He closed his eyes, telling himself it was just a bed, just like any other. For a while, he lay there, his body growing heavier with sleep. But something wasn't right. His body began to feel numb, like the warmth was being sucked out of him. Like his own skin was becoming alien, foreign. His limbs felt cold, colder than he had ever felt before. And the blanket seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. The air around him grew thicker, and it was as if the room itself was holding its breath. The bed creaked softly, like it was settling, but there was something else beneath that sound, something far more sinister. It was as though the bed itself was moving. Henry's breath quickened. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't respond. His arms felt as though they were bound to the mattress, as if invisible hands were holding him in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only feel the cold, the weight, the pressure building on him. And then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the mattress was whispering. It wasn't words, not exactly, but something that felt like a voice. A voice that came from deep inside the bed, coming from everywhere at once. "You're here," it seemed to say. "And now, you're mine." The words, or the feeling of them, made Henry's chest tighten. He tried to scream, to move, but he couldn't. He could feel the bed pulling at him, sucking at him, taking him piece by piece. His thoughts felt distant. His body seemed to be slipping away, and all he could do was lie there, trapped. The sheets rustled around him, tightening like coils, as the room grew darker and darker. The bed wasn't just a bed, it was a creature that had waited for him, waited for the moment when he would be foolish enough to climb in. And now that he had, there was no way out. By morning, the bed was empty. The sheets were crumpled, the mattress cold and undisturbed, but Henry was gone. No one knew what happened to him, only that he was gone. The bed, as always, waited for the next child, the next fool who would climb in, thinking they could prove the story wrong. And when they did, the bed would feed. Story number 10. The bed's last meal. Charlie had always known the bed was there. It had been in his grandmother's house for as long as he could remember, old, wooden, and covered with a faded quilt. It sat in the guest room, a room no one really used, tucked away in the back of the house where the light never quite seemed to reach. The bed wasn't anything special. It was just another strange thing in the house, like the creaky floorboards or the dusty old portrait of some long-forgotten relative hanging on the wall. It had always been there, and it never bothered him. But then, one night, his little sister, Lucy, decided to sleep in it. It was a typical summer evening, the kind where the air felt thick with humidity, and the house smelled like the earth outside. Charlie and Lucy had spent the day exploring the woods behind the house, and by the time dinner was over they were both exhausted. Lucy, who was younger and braver than Charlie ever gave her credit for, decided she wanted to sleep in the old guest room. "Come on, Charlie, it'll be fun," she said, her voice full of excitement as she jumped onto the bed. Charlie hesitated, glancing over at the bed. He had always avoided it. Something about the way it looked, old, worn, and unnervingly still, made him feel uneasy. It was as if the bed had been waiting for something, but he brushed the thought away. It was just a bed. After all, Grandma never said anything about it. "You sure you want to sleep in there?" Charlie asked. Lucy just laughed and pulled the covers up around her. "Why not?" "It's just a bed." That night, Charlie heard the soft sound of her voice coming from the guest room. At first, he thought nothing of it. Lucy was probably just talking to herself, like she always did when she got tired. But then, around midnight, something felt off. The house was quieter than usual, too quiet. Charlie tried to sleep, but the silence seemed to press in from all sides. He tossed and turned, but every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts kept returning to the guest room. Something wasn't right. Charlie got up from his bed, unable to shake the nagging feeling in his chest. He walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. As he neared the guest room, he paused outside the door, listening. There was a sound, low, almost like a hum, but deep, like the bed was sighing. He slowly pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. Lucy was lying in the bed, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes wide open and unblinking. The quilt, which had once been neatly pulled up around her, was now twisted around her limbs, as though it had a mind of its own. Her body seemed frozen in place, her breath shallow, as if something was holding her there, something beyond her control. And the bed, Charlie could swear the bed had moved. It looked somehow bigger, the frame slightly shifted, as if it had stretched to make room for her. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and the bed, Charlie could feel it now, like it was pulling at him, like it was waiting for him too. "Lucy?" Charlie whispered, his voice trembling. But Lucy didn't respond. Her lips were pale, her eyes unblinking, staring into nothing. It was like she wasn't really there anymore, like the bed had taken something from her. And that's when Charlie understood. The bed wasn't just a bed. It wasn't just some old piece of furniture left behind in the corner of the room. It was something darker. Something that fed, that grew hungrier with each passing year. It had already taken Lucy, and it was coming for him next. Charlie backed away from the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to get out of the room. He knew he had to wake his parents, get help. But as he turned to leave, the bed creaked again. It was almost like a whisper, like a call. Charlie ran. He didn't even look back. He sprinted down the hall into his parents' room, his chest tight with fear. He grabbed his mother's arm, shaking her awake. "Mom, wake up. Lucy's in the guest room. Something's wrong. She's not herself." His mother rubbed her eyes and sighed, groggy from sleep. "Charlie, what are you talking about?" But Charlie couldn't wait. He dragged her out of bed, pulling her towards the guest room, his heart racing. He tried to scream for Lucy, but his voice caught in his throat. When they reached the door, Charlie froze. The guest room was empty. The bed was still there, just as it had always been, but Lucy was gone. There was no trace of her. Not a single sign that she had ever been there at all. Charlie's mother looked confused, turning to him. "Lucy isn't in here, Charlie. Are you sure you—" But then the bed creaked again, and Charlie felt it. Something was there, watching him, waiting. The bed didn't stop at Lucy. It didn't stop at just one. It had tasted her, and now it wanted more. It was coming for him too. And he knew, deep down, that this time it wouldn't let him go. Not unless it had everything he had. Every ounce of fear, every piece of his childhood. It would take it all. The bed wasn't just hungry for children. It was hungry for souls. And Charlie could feel it in the air, the weight of it, pressing down on him, pulling him closer.